are back, and we are joined now by Premilla Nadasen, professor of history at Barnard College, distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, author of her latest book, Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Premilla, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Emma. It's great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you as well. Back for our Peacock show, we had a conversation about your piece in The Nation surrounding this topic of care work and its importance and how it came to the fore in the pandemic. Let's just start there. How our collective experience in this country in the pandemic exposed these massive, massive gaping holes in the way we've structured our society as it relates to care work.
Yeah. So, care, when we talk about care work, I think it's important to define what it is we're talking about. And so care, I think, is all the labor that allows us to sustain ourselves day to day, allows us to live and thrive. As Domestic Workers United, organization here in New York City, said, it's the work that makes all other work possible: the feeding, the nurturing, the assisting and loving human beings. And this was traditionally women's work, although it is now largely in the marketplace. And during the pandemic, I think what we saw is a real discrepancy in who was cared for and how they were cared for. So some people's care is privileged over other people's care. So there was visible recognition of essential workers and care workers during the pandemic. And I was outside at 7 p.m., like a lot of people in New York City, banging pots and pans as a way to acknowledge and appreciate care workers. So we do talk about the value of this work. But those essential workers didn't always get the pay and the benefits and the protections that they needed. And in fact, their service was very often framed as necessary to care for other people, right? So they were considered important to the degree that they took care of other more privileged people, but their well-being was often not mentioned, or if it was mentioned, it depended upon the care work that they provided.
Essential work, but what is the essentiality of it, or what is so essential about it? It's one, we saw, I believe it was the lieutenant governor of Texas, or maybe the attorney general, I forget who. It was the lieutenant governor at the time, at the outset, maybe spring 2020, saying, well, I think grandma and grandpa would be happy to get people back to work and sacrifice themselves if it meant getting the economy back on track. And that just stuck out to me as a real, a wonderful example of the priorities of the kind of get back to work crowd at the outset of the pandemic and who bore the brunt of that. I mean, the essential workers ranged from different fields, from medical workers, as you describe, hospital workers, to just minimum wage workers working at McDonald's or wherever, or DoorDash delivery drivers. But care workers in particular, it's just this very direct relationship of some people deserve to be cared for, and they're the people that can pay for care. And some people, this kind of underclass of largely women of color, are there to be the caregivers for profit. And that's much of what you explore, of course, in your book.
That's right. And so we as a society, I think, value care, and we talk about the importance of care, but there is a large sector of our population that is not cared for. Since the mid-1990s, we have not had anything like a welfare system in this country. Welfare has been dismantled, has been turned into block grants. And so poor single mothers don't really have an alternative apart from entering the labor market. The jobs that are available for people who are care workers or low-wage workers is not enough to raise a family. And so I think that question of how people are able to survive right now is critical. We have something like 40 million Americans who are living in poverty, right? 1.5 million American households live in what is called extreme poverty, nearly twice as many. And so I think the question we have to ask is, what kind of support systems exist that's outside the marketplace that is available for people who are the most marginalized, who are most in need? Many of these care workers who you're talking about don't have guaranteed benefits, don't have health insurance themselves, don't have a system to rely on if for some reason they have to exit the labor market, don't have a way to find affordable childcare for their own children, or often separated from their children. Many of these are migrant workers who are coming from abroad, who have no choice but to leave their children in their home countries. And many of them are undocumented, which means that they are also vulnerable to exploitation by their employers and by the state. And so it's a really crucial situation where we have actually not cared for people who are providing essential labor to all of us. If we didn't have childcare workers, we wouldn't be able to go to work every day, right? If we didn't have people who were producing the food, we wouldn't be able to feed ourselves every day. So it's really important work, and I think needs to be acknowledged and recognized in a material way.
Absolutely. And, it reminds me of how in September of last year, Gavin Newsom in California actually vetoed a bill that came through the Democratic legislature in the state that would have allowed housekeepers, nannies, and other workers who work in domestic workplaces, they would have had rights under OSHA. This is a Democratic governor who clearly has broader aspirations, who vetoed a bill giving domestic workers rights. Just your response to that, and I guess we can talk about it in less like an electoral partisanship way and more just about capitalism.
Yeah. Well, there's a long history of exclusion of domestic workers from the rights of labor. Back in the 1930s, that was a key turning point when most workers in this country got the basic rights that we think of as necessary for people to work in this country: minimum wage, social security benefits, the right to organize. Those are the three pillars of the 1930s New Deal program. Domestic workers were excluded from that, as were agricultural workers, because these were largely non-white occupations, mostly African Americans who worked in those two occupations. And that long history has carried forward. Domestic workers today do have the right to Social Security and to minimum wage, although we know that that's not enforced in most cases. But they don't have rights to OSHA protections, and they do not have the right to organize and bargain collectively. And
Mm.
so I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Why is it that these workers, who we all have acknowledged vis-a-vis the pandemic how important this work is, and this question of childcare now is a huge one for most Americans. Why don't these workers have the basic rights and protections that most other workers in this country have?
Well, I think the answer is leverage, right? I mean, it's the same reason we militarize the border and make it so difficult for folks to get citizenship. The dirty secret is that people having less protections or having that point of leverage over them when it comes to their undocumented status, but also their lack of union representation or formal kind of recognition, it allows for more exploitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the question of organizing and people's ability to organize is really crucial. And domestic workers have begun to organize outside the formal union structure. And I think that's been really important in terms of raising the questions and the issues that are important for this workforce. But I still think we have a long way to go. I think there's so much emphasis on, as you said a few minutes ago, about getting people back into the workforce, that I think there is a sense that we have to do that at all costs, even if it means the exploitation of a certain class of workers. But the other question I would raise, Emma, is why don't we have a system where families can take care of their own children? Right?
Right.
Why is the framework always one of forcing people into the labor market? There are middle class families, there are poor families who actually do want to stay home and take care of their own children. If we value child raising, if we value parenting, we should actually have some kind of child allowance, which is widespread in Europe, that allows families to stay home and take care of their children, whether they're poor or middle class or wealthy.
Certainly, and you talk about this in your book about how in the 1970s, neoliberalism, the kind of shredding of the social safety net, really gave rise to this industry in the United States. Talk a bit about that turn and how care work kind of became this own industry unto itself.
Yeah. I think the 1970s was a crucial turning point. Prior to that, we did have a welfare state. We had a system of economic support, a government system of economic support that provided stipends, however inadequate they were, provided stipends to poor single mothers. We had, there were social movements that called for expanding economic support for families and mothers in particular. The Wages for Housework movement was one that was an international movement that fought for wages for housewives. This was a mostly middle class white movement, but they gained some traction. We had a campaign to push for national daycare, right? And that was vetoed by President Nixon. And then in the 1970s, we begin to see the dismantling, the slow dismantling, the attacks on the welfare system. And by 1996, all forms of government support on the national level have essentially been dismantled. And so today we have a system where people are thrust into a low wage labor market, earning far less than is necessary, that is well below the poverty line if you're earning minimum wage. And in fact, very few alternatives. I work with a group in Mississippi that is fighting for basic rights for poor families. And Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the country. And the average monthly stipend for a family, average monthly welfare stipend for a family in Mississippi is $260 for a family of three, which is outrageous. And in fact, much of the welfare money in Mississippi has actually gone into the private sector because what the state does is they take those welfare dollars and they contract out private companies who then administer the program or who run training programs or who hire lecturers. There's been a huge scandal in Mississippi around this. And so for me, it's a real question of political priorities and who's benefiting from these state programs at the moment.
Sir, yes, and I mean, of course, since we spoke in 2021, I think the child tax credit died on the vine due to Joe Manchin and other more conservative Democrats making it so that that program would essentially sunset, even though we know that it lifted millions and millions of children out of poverty in this country. I mean, in writing your book, in the midst of that moment, what did that say about our country's priorities when it comes to childcare and care work as well?
There was such a contradiction between the rhetoric that we heard about what people valued, or especially vis-a-vis care work, around what we saw day to day in our own communities, and the families we interact with, that we interacted with, the void that we saw around care work and what was happening around the child care tax credit. We know that the child care tax credit was a huge benefit to so many families. It lifted people out of poverty in a way that we had not seen since the 1930s. And so it is a bit shocking that given that history of the pandemic, that in fact, that bill failed. And I will say, I think we need to push for an expanded child tax credit, just like we had during the pandemic. But I also think it even needs to be more expansive than those proposals. There are, we know, undocumented children who did not benefit even from the expanded child tax credit. So I think we need to think about the gaps and the loopholes in the child tax credit and think about how to make sure it is in fact universal and covers everyone.
Absolutely. Can you touch on the racial politics of this and particularly care workers, in the South, but all over the country, being Black women in many instances, and how some of the continued structures of slavery, Jim Crow, etc., are brought into the forefront by some of those dynamics?
Well, the primary reason why African American women ended up being the the central labor force as domestic workers up until the 1960s was because of the history of slavery. African American women served as domestic workers, especially in the South, but then also in the North during slavery and after the end of slavery. Other occupations were closed to them, so they were essentially shuttled into domestic work after emancipation. When they began to leave domestic work in the 1960s with the removal of racial barriers to occupations, we saw large numbers of immigrant women, mostly women from the global South, who started working as domestic workers. So race has been really fundamental to shaping this occupation and the workforce, in part because these women are so underpaid and so marginalized that race becomes the lens through which I think employers sometimes justify the low wages. And so it serves a kind of ideological function to think of these workers who some people might think they just need less than I do, right? It's
Mm.
okay to pay them a little less. It's okay if they work a little longer. They're different. That question of difference, I think, is key. I will also say, so race is important in terms of thinking about who's doing this work and how they're treated, how they're marginalized. It's also important because the care work of these women for their own families has
Right.
always been undervalued. So African American women historically left their homes and lived in with families who they worked for, even when they had their own children. So they had very little time to spend with their own children. The migrant women who are leaving their children in another country, their care work for their own family is devalued. And of course, the best example of that is the system of welfare, which when it started was intended to assist white widows for the most part. And when women of color, Puerto Rican women and African American women began to enter the welfare rolls in the 1950s and the 1960s, is when the program became more punitive and work rules were first instituted. And so that's another indication of how there really has never been state support for the mothering work of Black and Brown women in this country.
Um, we have a viewer IM, and I think you may have touched on it, but I wanted to make sure Margot from Massachusetts answer question gets answered. How would you distinguish between care work and reproductive labor? Is it because care work includes jobs that are paid in the market, whereas reproductive laborers only are unpaid, or is there more overlap?
hmm I would want to know what Margot means by reproductive labor. If it's just about birthing, that is, I mean, obviously there are not people who are paid for that. Apart from surrogates, surrogates are paid for that labor, but Marxist feminists have historically used the term social reproductive labor to refer to care work, and I think that term is actually really useful, perhaps more useful than the term care work. So they understand social reproductive labor as all the labor necessary to maintain and sustain and reproduce human life, whether it's inside the household or outside the household, whether it's paid or unpaid. And it includes education, it includes healthcare, it includes feeding people, it includes everything we think of that is necessary for our lives. I think it's a really useful term because it moves us away from care, which is often associated with emotion. We think about care workers as people who should be invested in the labor emotionally. And social reproductive labor, I think, helps us think about it in a structural framework, that this is work that is about social reproduction.
Right. Well, that'll be my last question, and I'll let you go, Premilla, because that is the piece that is so um, frustrating. The expectation of emotional labor for care workers on top of the sacrifices that you talk about, because inherently the social reproductive element comes into play, families, childbirth, elder care, right? This kind of, or child care, all these things are involved. Can you talk about the emotional labor that care workers have to engage in?
Yeah, and I've spoken to a lot of domestic workers about this. I do a lot of work here in New York and around the country. And many domestic workers love their jobs. right? And they might even love the people who they work for and the children they care for, but they don't do the work because of that love. They do the work because of the wages that
Right.
allow them to survive day to day. And I think that's the important distinction. And there might be workers who don't love the people who they care for, but they do a good job. So I think we need to separate the kind of work that somebody does and whether or not they do their job from their emotional investment in it. You know, we don't expect other people in other occupations. I'm a professor, right? I might love my students, I might not love my students, but the question is, do I do my job? And so I think we have to think critically about whether we ask domestic workers to invest in this labor emotionally, and if so, why.
Premilla Nadasen. The book is called Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, professor of history at Barnard College. We will put a link to your book wherever people are listening to or watching this and at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Emma. Great to speak with you.
Great to speak with you as well.